Chapter 7 of Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. Some Fairy Tales of Long Ago. The little brown boys and girls who lived in Egypt 3,000 years ago were just as fond as you are of hearing wonderful stories that begin with "Once upon a time," and I want in this chapter to tell you some of the tales that Tahuti and Senseb used to listen to in the evening when school was over and play was done. The oldest of all wonder tales, stories that were old and had long been forgotten, ages before the Sleeping Beauty and Jack and the Beanstalk were first thought of. One day, when King Khufu, the great king who built the biggest of the pyramids, had nothing else to do, he called his sons and his wise men together and said, "Is there anyone among you who can tell me the tales of the old magicians?" Then the king's son, Prince Baufra, stood up and said, "Your Majesty, I can tell you of a wonder that happened in the days of your father, King Sneferu. It fell on a day that the king grew weary of everything, and sought through all his palace for something to please him, but found nothing. Then he said to his officers, 'Bring to me the magician Zazamankh.' And when the magician came, the king said to him, 'O Zazamankh, I have sought through all my palace for some delight, and I have found none.' Then said Zazamankh, 'Let thy Majesty go in a boat upon the lake of the palace, and let 20 beautiful girls be brought to row thee, and let their oars be of ebony, inlaid with gold and silver. And I myself will go with thee, and the sight of the water birds, and the fair shores, and the green grass will cheer thy heart.' So the king and the wizard went down to the lake, and the 20 maidens rowed them about in the king's pleasure galley. 9 rowed on this side, and 9 on that, and the 2 fairest stood by the 2 rudders at the stern, and set the rowing song, each for her own side. And the king's heart grew glad and light, as the boat sped hither and thither, and the oars flashed in the sunshine to the song of the rowers. But as the boat turned, the top of the steering oar struck the hair of one of the maidens who steered, and knocked her coronet of turquoise into the water, and she stopped her song, and all the rowers on her side stopped rowing. Then his Majesty said, 'Why have you stopped rowing, little one?' And the maiden answered, 'It is because my jewel of turquoise has fallen into the water.' 'Row on,' said the king, 'and I will give you another.' But the girl answered, 'I want my own one back, as I had it before.' So King Sneferu called Zazamankh to come to him, and said, 'Now, Zazamankh, I have done as you advised, and my heart is light. But behold, the coronet of this little one has fallen into the water, and she has stopped singing, and spoiled the rowing of her side, and she will not have a new jewel, but wants the old one back.' Then Zazamankh the wizard stood up in the king's boat, and spoke wonderful words. And lo, the water of one half of the lake rose up, and heaped itself upon the top of the water of the other half, so that it was twice as deep as it was before. And the king's bark rode upon the top of the piled up waters, but beyond it the bottom of the lake lay bare, with the shells and pebbles shining in the sunlight. And there, upon a broken shell, lay the little rower's coronet. Then Zazamankh leaped down and picked it up, and brought it to the king. And he spake wonderful words again, and the water sank down and covered the whole bed of the lake, as it had done at first. So his Majesty spent a joyful day, and gave great rewards to the wizard Zazamankh. When King Khufu heard that story, he praised the men of olden times. But another of his sons, Prince Hordadef, stood up, and said, 'O king, that is only a story of bygone days, and no one knows whether it is true or a lie, but I will show thee a magician of today.' 'Who is he, Hordadef?' said King Khufu. And Hordadef answered, 'His name is Dedi. He is 110 years old, and every day he eats 500 loaves of bread, and a side of beef, and drinks 100 jugs of beer. He knows how to fasten on a head that has been cut off. He knows how to make a lion of the desert follow him, and he knows the plan of the house of God that you have wanted to know for so long.' Then King Khufu sent Prince Hordadef to bring Dedi to him, and he brought Dedi back in the royal boat. The king came out, and sat in the colonnade of the palace, and Dedi was led before him. Then said his Majesty, 'Why have I never seen you before, Dedi?' And Dedi answered, 'Life, health, and strength to your Majesty. A man can only come when he is called.' 'Is it true, Dedi, that you can fasten on a head which has been cut off?' 'Certainly I can, your Majesty.' Then said the king, 'Let a prisoner be brought from the prison, and let his head be struck off.' But Dedi said, 'Long life to your Majesty. Do not try it on a man. Let us try a bird or an animal.' So a goose was brought, its head was cut off, and the head was laid at the east side of the hall, and the body at the west. Then Dedi rose, and spoke wonderful words. And behold, the body of the goose waddled to meet the head, and the head came to meet the body. They joined together before his Majesty's throne, and the goose stood up and cackled. Then, when Dedi had joined to its body again the head that had been struck off from the ox, and the ox followed him, lowing, King Khufu said to him, "Is it true, Dedi, that you know the plans of the house of God?" "It is true, your Majesty, but it is not I who shall give them to you." "Who then?" said the king. "It is the eldest of 3 sons who shall be born to the lady Rud Didi, wife of the priest of Ra, the sun god. And Ra has promised that these 3 sons shall reign over this kingdom of thine." When King Khufu heard that word, his heart was troubled. But Dedi said, "Let not your Majesty's heart be troubled. Thy son shall reign first, then thy son's son, and then one of these." So the king commanded that Dedi should live in the house of Prince Hordadef, and that every day there should be given to him 1,000 loaves, 100 jugs of beer, an ox, and 100 bunches of onions. When the 3 sons of Rud Dide were born, Ra sent 4 goddesses to be their godmothers. They came attired like travelling dancing girls, and one of the gods came with them, dressed like a porter. And when they had nursed the 3 children a while, Rud Dide's husband said to them, "My ladies, what wages shall I give you?" So he gave them a bushel of barley, and they went away with their wages. But when they had gone a little way, Isis, the chief of them, said, "Why have we not done a wonder for these children?" So they stopped, and made crowns, the red crown and the white crown of Egypt, and hid them in the bushel of barley, and sealed the sack, and put it in Rud Didet's store chamber, and went away again. A fortnight later, when Rud Didet was going to brew the household beer, there was no barley. And her maidservant said, "There is a bushel, but it was given to the dancing girls, and lies in the storeroom, sealed with their seal." So the lady said to her maid, "Go down and fetch it, and we shall give them more when they need it." The maid went down, but when she came to the storeroom, lo! from within there came a sound of singing and dancing, and all such music as should be heard in a king's court. So in fear she crept back to her mistress and told her, and Rud Didet went down and heard the royal music, and she told her husband when he came home at night, and their hearts were glad, because their sons were to be kings. But after a time the lady Rud Didet quarrelled with her maid, and gave her a beating, as ladies sometimes did in those days, and the weeping maid said to her fellow servants, "Shall she do this to me? She has borne 3 kings, and I will go and tell it to his Majesty King Khufu." So she stole away first to her uncle, and told him of her plot, but he was angry, because she wished to betray the children to King Khufu, and he beat her with a scourge of flax. And as she went away by the side of the river, a great crocodile came out of the water, and carried her off. But here, alas, our story breaks off, the rest of the book is lost, and we cannot tell whether King Khufu tried to kill the 3 royal babies or not. Only we do know that the first 3 kings of the race which succeeded the race of Khufu bore the same names as Rud Didet's 3 babies, and were called, like all the kings of Egypt after them, sons of the sun. These, then, are absolutely the oldest fairy stories in the world, and if they do not seem very wonderful to you, you must remember that everything has to have a beginning, and that the people who made these tales hadn't had very much practice in the art of storytelling. End of Chapter 7. Read by Sabella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. Some Fairy Tales of Long Ago, continued. Our next story belongs to a time several hundred years later, and I dare say it seemed as wonderful to the little Egyptians as the story of Sinbad the Sailor does to you. It is called The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor, and the sailor himself tells it to a noble Egyptian. "I was going," he says, "to the mines of Pharaoh, and we set sail in a ship of 150 cubits long and 40 cubits wide, 225 feet by 60 feet, quite a big ship for the time. We had a crew of 150 of the best sailors of Egypt, men whose hearts were bold as lions. They all foretold a happy voyage, but as we came to the shore a great storm blew, the sea rose in terrible waves, and our ship was fairly overwhelmed. Clinging to a piece of wood, I was washed about for 3 days, and at last tossed up on an island, but not one was left of all my shipmates, all perished in the waves. I lay down in the shade of some bushes, and when I had recovered a little, I looked about me for food. There was plenty on every hand, figs and grapes, berries and corn, with all manner of birds. When my hunger was satisfied, I lit a fire, and made an offering to the gods who had saved me. Suddenly I heard a noise like thunder, the trees shook, and the earth quaked. Looking around, I saw a great serpent approaching me. He was nearly 50 feet long, and had a beard 3 feet in length. His body shone in the sun like gold, and when he reared himself up from his coils before me, I fell upon my face. Then the serpent began to speak. "What has brought thee, little one? What has brought thee? If thou dost not tell me quickly what has brought thee to this isle, I shall make thee vanish like a flame." So saying, he took me up in his mouth, carried me gently to his lair, and laid me down unhurt, and again he said, "What has brought thee, little one? What has brought thee to this isle of the sea?" So I told him the story of our shipwreck, and how I alone had escaped the fury of the waves. Then he said to me, "Fear not, little one, and let not thy face be sad. If thou hast come to me, it is God who has brought thee to this isle, which is filled with all good things. And now, see, thou shalt dwell for 4 months in this isle, and then a ship of thine own land shall come, and thou shalt go home to thy country, and die in thine own town. As for me, I am here with my brethren and my children. There are 75 of us in all, besides a young girl, who came here by chance, and was burned by fire from heaven. But if thou art strong and patient, thou shalt yet embrace thy children and thy wife, and return to thy home." Then I bowed low before him, and promised to tell of him to Pharaoh, and to bring him ships full of all the treasures of Egypt. But he smiled at my speech, and said, "Thou hast nothing that I need, for I am prince of the land of Punt, and all its perfumes are mine. Moreover, when thou departest, thou shalt never again see this isle, for it shall be changed into waves." Now behold, when the time was come, and as he had foretold, the ship drew near. And the good serpent said to me, "Farewell, farewell. Go to thy home, little one, see again thy children, and let thy name be good in thy town. These are my wishes for thee." So I bowed low before him, and he loaded me with precious gifts of perfume, cassia, sweet woods, ivory, baboons, and all kinds of precious things, and I embarked in the ship. And now, after a voyage of 2 months, we are coming to the house of Pharaoh, and I shall go in before Pharaoh, and offer the gifts which I have brought from this isle into Egypt, and Pharaoh shall thank me before the great ones of the land. Our last story belongs to a later age than that of the shipwrecked sailor. About 1500 years before Christ there arose in Egypt a race of mighty soldier kings, who founded a great empire, which stretched from the Sudan right through Syria and Mesopotamia as far as the great river Euphrates. Mesopotamia, or Naharena, as the Egyptians called it, had been an unknown land to them before this time, but now it became to them what America was to the men of Queen Elizabeth's time, or the heart of Africa to your grandfathers, the wonderful land of romance, where all kinds of strange things might happen. And this story of the doomed prince, which I have to tell you, belongs partly to Naharena, and, as you will see, some of our own fairy stories have been made out of very much the same materials as are used in it. Once upon a time there was a king in Egypt who had no child. His heart was grieved because he had no child, and he prayed to the gods for a son. So in course of time a son was born to him, and the Fates, like fairy godmothers, came to his cradle to foretell what should happen to him. And when they saw him, they said, "His doom is to die either by the crocodile, or by the serpent, or by the dog." When the king heard this, his heart felt sore for his little son, and he resolved that he would put the boy where no harm could come to him. So he built for him a beautiful house away in the desert, and furnished it with all kinds of fine things, and sent the boy there, with faithful servants to guard him, to see that he came to no hurt. So the boy grew up, quietly and safely, in his house in the desert. But it fell on the day that the young prince looked out from the roof of his house, and he saw a man walking across the desert, with a dog following him. So he said to the servant who was with him, "What is this that walks behind the man who is coming along the road?" "It is a dog," said the page. Then the boy said, "You must bring me one like him." And the page went and told his majesty. Then the king said, "Get a little puppy and take it to him, lest his heart be sad." So they brought him a little dog, and it grew up along with him. Now it happened that, when the boy had grown to be a strong young man, he grew weary of being always shut up in his fine house. Therefore he sent a message to his father, saying, "Why am I always to be shut up here? Since I am doomed to 3 evil fates, let me have my desire, and let God do what is in his heart." So the king agreed, and they gave the young prince arms, and sent him away to the eastern frontier, and his dog went with him, and they said to him, "Go wherever you will." So he went northward, through the desert, he and his dog, until he came to the land of Naharaina. Now the chief of the land of Naharaina had no children, save one beautiful daughter, and for her he had built a wonderful house. It had 70 windows, and it stood on a great rock more than 100 feet high. And the chief summoned the sons of all the chiefs of the country round about, and said to them, "The prince who can climb to my daughter's window shall have her for his wife." So all the young princes of the land camped round the house, and tried every day to climb to the window of the beautiful princess, but none of them succeeded, for the rock was very steep and high. Then one day, when they were climbing as they were wont, the young prince of Egypt rode by with his dog, and the princes welcomed him, bathed him, and fed his horse, and said to him, "Whence comest thou, thou goodly youth?" He did not wish to tell them that he was the son of Pharaoh, so he answered, "I am the son of an Egyptian officer. My father married a second wife, and when she had children, she hated me, and drove me away from my home." So they took him into their company, and he stayed with them many days. Now it fell on a day that he asked them, "Why do you stay here, trying always to climb this rock?" And they told him of the beautiful princess who lived in the house on the top of the rock, and how the man who could climb to her window should marry her. Therefore the young prince of Egypt climbed along with them, and it came to pass that at last he climbed to the window of the princess, and when she saw him, she fell in love with him and kissed him. Then was word sent to the chief of Naharaina that one of the young men had climbed to his daughter's window, and when he asked which of the princes it was, and the messenger said, "It is not a prince, but the son of an Egyptian officer, who has been driven away from Egypt by his stepmother." Then the chief of Naharaina was very angry, and said, "Shall I give my daughter to an Egyptian fugitive? Let him go back to Egypt." But when the messengers came to tell the young man to go away, the princess seized his hand, and said, "If you take him from me, I will not eat, I will not drink. I shall die in that same hour." Then the chief sent men to kill the youth where he was in the house. But the princess said, "If you kill him, I shall be dead before the sun goes down. I will not live an hour if I am parted from him." So the chief was obliged to agree to the marriage, and the young prince was married to the princess, and her father gave them a house, and slaves, and fields, and all sorts of good things. But after a time the young prince said to his wife, "I am doomed to die, either by a crocodile, or by a serpent, or by a dog." And his wife answered, "Why then do you keep this dog always with you? Let him be killed." "Nay," said he, "I am not going to kill my faithful dog, which I have brought up since the time he was a puppy." So the princess feared greatly for her husband, and would never let him go out of her sight. Now it happened in course of time that the prince went back to the land of Egypt, and his wife with him, and his dog, and he dwelt in Egypt. And one day, when the evening came, he grew drowsy, and fell asleep, and his wife filled a bowl with milk and placed it by his side, and sat to watch him as he slept. Then a great serpent came out of his hole to bite the youth. But his wife was watching, and she made the servants give the milk to the serpents, and he drank till he could not move. Then the princess killed the serpent with blows of her dagger. So she woke her husband, and he was astonished to see the serpent lying dead, and his faithful wife said to him, "Behold, God has given one of thy dooms into thy hand. He will also give the others." And the prince made sacrifices to God, and praised him. Now it fell on a day that the prince went out to walk in his estate, and his dog went with him. As they walked, the dog ran after some game, and the prince followed the dog. They came to the river Nile, and the dog went into the river, and the prince followed him. Then a great crocodile rose in the river, and laid hold on the youth, and said, "I am thy doom, following after thee." But just here the old papyrus roll on which the story is written is torn away, and we do not know what happened to the doomed prince. I fancy that, in some way or other, his dog would save him from the crocodile, and that later, by some accident, the poor faithful dog would be the cause of his master's death. At least, it looks as if the end of the story must have been something like that, for the Egyptians believed that no one could escape from the doom that was laid upon him, but had to suffer it sooner or later. Perhaps some day one of the explorers who are searching the land of Egypt for relics of the past may come upon another papyrus roll with the end of the story, and then we shall find out whether the dog did kill the prince, or whether God gave all his dooms into his hand, as his wife had hoped. These are some of the stories that little Tahuti and Senseb used to listen to in the long evenings when they were tired of play. Perhaps they seem very simple and clumsy to you, but I have no doubt that when they were told in those old days, the black eyes of the little Egyptian boys and girls used to grow very big and round, and the wizard who could fasten on the heads which had been cut off seemed a very wonderful person, and the talking serpents and crocodiles seemed very real and very dreadful. Anyhow, you have heard the oldest stories in the world, the fathers and mothers, so to speak, of all the great family of wonder tales that have delighted and terrified children ever since. End of Chapter 8. Read by Sibella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. Exploring the Sudan. There is no more wonderful or interesting story than that which tells how, bit by bit, the great dark continent of Africa has been explored, and made to yield up its secrets. But did you ever think what a long history it is, and how very early it begins? It is in Egypt that we find the first chapters of the story, and they can still be read, written in the quaint old picture writing the Egyptians used, on the rock tombs of a palace in the south of Egypt called Elephantine. In early days the land of Egypt used to end at what was called the first cataract of the Nile, a place where the river came down in a series of rapids, along a lot of rocky isles. The first cataract has disappeared now, for British engineers have made a great dam across the Nile just at this point, and turned the whole country, for miles above the dam, into a lake. But in those days the Egyptians used to believe that the Nile, to which they owed so much, began at the first cataract. Yet they knew of the wild country of Nubia beyond, and in very early times indeed, about 5,000 years ago, they used to send exploring expeditions into that half-desert land, which we have come to know as the Sudan. Near the first cataract there lies the island of Elephantine, and when the Egyptian kingdom was young the great barons who owned this island were called the Lords of the Egyptian Marshes, just as the Percys and the Douglases were the Lords of the Marshes in England and Scotland. It was their duty to keep order in the wild Nubian tribes south of the cataract, to see that they allowed the trading caravans to pass safely, and sometimes to lead these caravans through the deserts themselves. A caravan was a very different thing then from the long train of camels that we think of now when we hear the name. For though there are some very old pictures which show that, before Egyptian history begins at all, the camel was known in Egypt, somehow that useful animal seems to have disappeared from the land for many hundreds of years. The pharaohs and their adventurous barons never used the queer, ungainly creature that carries the desert postman in our picture, and the ivory, gold dust, and ebony that came from the Sudan had to be carried on the backs of hundreds of asses. The barons of Elephantine bore the proud title of Keepers of the Door of the South, and in addition they display, seemingly just as proudly, the title Caravan Conductors. In those days it was no easy task to lead a caravan through the Sudan, and bring it back safe with its precious load, through all the wild and savage tribes who inhabited the land of Nubia. More than one of the barons of Elephantine set out with a caravan never to return, but to leave his bones, and those of his companions, to whiten along the desert sands, and one of them has told us how, hearing that his father had been killed on one of these adventurous journeys, he mustered his retainers, marched south with a train of 100 asses, punished the tribe which had been guilty of the deed, and brought his father's body home, to be buried with all due honours. Some of the records of these early journeys, the first attempts to explore the interior of Africa, may still be read, carved on the walls of the tombs where the brave explorers sleep. One baron, called Herkhuf, has told us of no fewer than 4 separate expeditions which he made in the Sudan. On his first journey he was still young; he went in company with his father, and was away for 7 months. The next time he was allowed to go home, and brought back his caravan safely, after an absence of 8 months. On his third journey he went farther than before, and gathered so large a quantity of ivory and gold dust that 300 asses were required to bring his treasure home. Such a rich caravan was a tempting prize for the wild tribes on the way, but Herkhuf persuaded one of the Sudanese chiefs to furnish him with a large escort, and the caravan was so strongly guarded that the other tribes did not venture to attack it, but were glad to help its leader with guides and gifts of cattle. Herkhuf brought his treasures safely back to Egypt, and the king was so pleased with his success that he sent a special messenger with a boat full of delicacies to refresh the weary traveller. But the most successful of all his expeditions was the fourth. The king who had sent him on the other journeys had died, and was succeeded by a little boy called Pepi, who was only about 6 years old when he came to the throne, and who reigned for more than 90 years, the longest reign in the world's history. In the second year of Pepi's reign the bold Herkhuf set out again for the Soudan, and this time, along with other treasures, he brought back something that his boy king valued far more than gold or ivory. You know how, when Stanley went in search of Emin Pasha, he discovered in the Central African forests a strange race of dwarfs, living by themselves and very shy of strangers. Well, for all these thousands of years, the forefathers of these little dwarfs must have been living in the heart of the Dark Continent. In the early days they evidently lived not so far away from Egypt as when Stanley found them, for on at least one occasion one of Pharaoh's servants had been able to capture one of the little men, and bring him down as a present to his master, greatly to the delight of the king and court. Herkhuf was equally fortunate. He managed to secure a dwarf from one of these pygmy tribes, and brought him back with his caravan, that he might please the young king with his quaint antics and his curious dances. When the king heard of the present which his brave servant was bringing back for him, he was wild with delight. The thought of this new toy was far more to the little 8-year-old, king though he was, than all the rest of the treasure which Herkhuf had gathered, and he caused a letter to be written to the explorer, telling him of his delight, and giving him all kinds of advice as to how careful he should be that the dwarf should come to no harm on the way to court. The letter, through all its curious old phrases, is very much the kind of letter that any boy might send on hearing of some new toy that was coming to him. "My Majesty," says the little 8-year-old Pharaoh, "wisheth to see this pygmy more than all the tribute of Punt. And if thou comest to court having this pygmy with thee sound and whole, my Majesty will do more for thee than King Asa did for the Chancellor Barded." This was the man who had brought back the dwarf in earlier days. Little King Pepi then gives careful instructions that Herkhuf is to provide proper people to see that the precious dwarf does not fall into the Nile on his way down the river, and these guards are to watch behind the place where he sleeps, and look into his bed 10 times each night, that they may be sure that nothing has gone wrong. The poor little dwarf must have had rather an uncomfortable time of it, one fancies, if his sleep was to be broken so often. Perhaps there was more danger of killing him with kindness and care than if they had left him a little more to himself, but Pepi's anxiety was very like a boy. However, Herkhuf evidently succeeded in bringing his dwarf safe and sound to the king's court, and no doubt the quaint little savage proved a splendid toy for the young king. One wonders what he thought of the great cities and the magnificent court of Egypt, and whether his heart did not weary sometimes for the wild freedom of his lost home. Herkhuf was so proud of the king's letter that he caused it to be engraved, word for word, on the walls of the tomb which he hewed out for himself at Elephantine, and there to this day the words can be read which tell us how old is the story of African exploration, and how a boy was always just a boy, even though he lived 5,000 years ago and reigned over a great kingdom. End of Chapter 9. Read by Sibella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. A Voyage of Discovery. About 3,500 years ago there reigned a great queen in Egypt. It was not usual for the Egyptian throne to be occupied by a woman, though great respect was always shown to women in Egypt, and the rank of a king's mother was considered quite as important as that of his father. But once, at least, in her history Egypt had a great queen, whose fame deserves to be remembered, and who takes honourable rank among the great women, like Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria, who have ruled kingdoms. During part of her life Queen Hatshepsut was only joint sovereign along with her husband, and in the latter part of her reign she was joint sovereign with her half-brother or nephew, who succeeded her, but for at least 20 years she was really the sole ruler of Egypt, and governed the land wisely and well. Perhaps the most interesting thing that happened in her reign was the voyage of discovery which she caused to be made by some ships of her fleet. Centuries before her time, when the world was young, the Egyptians had made expeditions down the Red Sea to a land which they sometimes called Punt, and sometimes the Divine Land. Probably it was part of the country that we now know as Somaliland. But for a very long time these voyages had ceased, and people only knew by hearsay, and by the stories of ancient days, of this wonderful country that lay away by the Southern Sea. One day, the Queen tells us, she was at prayers in the temple of the god Amen at Thebes, when she felt a sudden inspiration. The god was giving her a command to send an expedition to this almost forgotten land. A command was heard in the sanctuary, a behest of the god himself, that the ways which lead to Punt should be explored, and that the roads to the ladders of incense should be trodden. In obedience to this command, the Queen at once equipped a little fleet of the quaint old galleys that the Egyptians then used, and sent them out, with picked crews and a royal envoy in command, to sail down the Red Sea, in search of the Divine Land. The ships were laden with all kinds of goods to barter with the Punnites, and a guard of Egyptian soldiers was placed on board. We do not know how long it took the little squadron to reach its destination. Sea voyages in those days were slow and dangerous. But the last ships safely reached the mouth of the Elephant River in Somaliland, and went up the river with the tide till they came to the village of the natives. They found that the Punnites lived in curious beehive-shaped houses, some of them made of wickerwork, and placed on piles, so that they had to climb into them by ladders. The men were not negroes, though some negroes lived among them. They were very much like the Egyptians in appearance, wore pointed beards, and were dressed only in loincloths, while the women wore a yellow sleeveless dress which reached half-way between the knee and ankle. Nessie, the royal envoy, landed with an officer and 8 soldiers, and to show that he came in peace, he spread out on a table some presents for the chief of the Punnites: 5 bracelets, 2 gold necklaces, a dagger, with belt and sheath, a battle-axe, and 11 rings of glass beads, much such a present as a European explorer might today give to an African chief. The natives came down in great excitement to see the strangers who had brought such treasures, and were astonished at the arrival of such a fleet. "How is it," they said, "that you have reached this country, hitherto unknown to men? Have you come by way of the sky, or have you sailed on the waters of the Divine Sea?" The chief, who was called Perahu, came down with his wife Ati, and his daughter. Ati rode on a donkey, but dismounted to see the strangers, and indeed the poor donkey must have been greatly relieved, for the chieftainess was an exceedingly fat lady, and her daughter, though so young, showed every intention of being as fat as her mother. After the envoy and the chief had exchanged compliments, business began. The Egyptians pitched a tent in which they stored their goods for barter, and to put temptation out of the way of the natives, they drew a guard of soldiers around the tent. For several days the market remained open, and the country people brought down their treasures till the ships were laden as deeply as was safe. The cargo was a varied and valuable one. Elephants' tusks, gold, ebony, apes, greyhounds, leopard skins, all were crowded into the galleys, the apes sitting gravely on the top of the bales of goods, and looking longingly at the land which they were leaving. But the most important part of the cargo was the incense and the incense trees. Great quantities of the gum from which the incense was made were placed on board, and also 31 of the incense sycamores, their roots carefully surrounded with a large ball of earth, and protected by baskets. Several young chiefs of the Punnites accompanied the expedition back to Thebes, to see what life was like in the strange new world which had been revealed to them. Altogether the voyage home must have been no easy undertaking, for the ships, with their heavy cargoes, must have been very difficult to handle. The arrival of the squadron at Thebes, which they must have reached by a canal connecting the Nile with the Red Sea, made the occasion of a great holiday festival. Long lines of troops in gala attire came out to meet the brave explorers, and an escort of the royal fleet accompanied the exploring squadron up to the temple quay where the ships were to moor. Then the Thebans feasted their eyes on the wonderful treasures that had come from Punt, wondering at the natives, the incense, the ivory, and above all at a giraffe which had been brought home. How the poor creature was stowed away on the little Egyptian ship it is hard to see, but there he was, with his spots and his long neck, the most wonderful creature that the good folks of Thebes had ever seen. The precious incense gum was stored in the temple, and the queen herself gave a bushel measure, made of a mixture of gold and silver, to measure it out with. So the voyage of discovery had ended in a great success. But Queen Hatshepsut's purpose was only half fulfilled as yet. In a nook of the limestone cliffs, not far from Thebes, her father before her had begun to build a very wonderful temple, close beside the ruins of an older sanctuary which had stood there for hundreds of years. Hatshepsut had been gradually completing his work, and the temple was now growing into a most beautiful building, very different from ordinary Egyptian temples. From the desert sands in front of it rose terrace above terrace, each platform bordered with rows of beautiful limestone pillars, until at last it reached the cliffs, and the most sacred chamber of it, the Holy of Holies, was hewn into the solid wall of rock behind. This temple the queen resolved to make into what she called a paradise for Amen, the god who had told her to send out the ships. So she planted on the terraces the sacred incense trees which had been brought from Punt, and thanks to careful tending and watering, they flourished well in their new home. And then, all along the walls of the temple, she caused her artists to carve and paint the whole story of the voyage. We do not know the names of the artists who did the work, though we know that of the architect, Senmut, who planned the building. But whoever they were, they must have been very skilful sculptors, for the whole story of the voyage is told in pictures on the wall of this wonderful temple, so that everything can be seen just as it actually happened more than 3,000 years ago. You can see the ships toiling along with oar and sail towards their destination, the meeting with the natives, the palaver and the trading, the loading of the galleys, and the long procession of Theban soldiers going out to meet the returning explorers. Not a single detail is missed, and thanks to the queen and her artists, we can go back over all these years, and see how the sailors worked, and how people lived in savage lands in that far-off time, and realize that explorers dealt with the natives in foreign countries in those days very much as they deal with them now. When our explorers of today come back for their journeys, they generally tell the story of their adventures in a big book with many pictures, but no explorer ever published the account of a voyage of discovery on such a scale as did Queen Hatshepsut when she carved the voyage to Punt on the walls of her great temple at Deir el Bahari, and no pictures in any modern book are likely to last as long, or to tell so much as these pictures that have come to light again during the last few years, after being buried for centuries under the desert sands. Queen Hatshepsut has left other memorials of her greatness besides the temple with its story of her voyage. She has told us how one day she was sitting in her palace and thinking of her Creator, when the thought came into her mind to rear 2 great obelisks before the temple of Amen at Karnak. So she gave the command, and Senmut, her clever architect, went up the Nile to Aswan, and carried 2 huge granite blocks and floated them down the river. Cleopatra's Needle, which stands on the Thames embankment, is 68 1/2 feet high, and it seems to us a huge stone for men to handle. Our own engineers had trouble enough in bringing it to this country and setting it up. But these 2 great obelisks of Queen Hatshepsut were 98 1/2 feet high, and weighed about 350 tons apiece. Yet Senmut had them quarried and set up and carved all over from base to summit in 7 months from the time when the queen gave her command. One of them still stands at Karnak, the tallest obelisk in the temple there, while the other great shaft has fallen, and lies broken close to its companion. They tell us their own plain story of the wisdom and skill of those far-off days, and perhaps the great queen, who thought of her Creator as she sat in her palace, and longed to honour him, found that the God whom she ignorantly worshipped was indeed not far from his servant's heart. End of Chapter 10. Read by Sibella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Of Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. Egyptian Books. The Egyptians were, if not quite the earliest, at least among the earliest of all peoples of the world to find out how to put down their thoughts in writing, or in other words, to make a book. And one of their old books, full of wise advice from a father to his son, is perhaps the oldest book in the world. 2 words which we are constantly using might help to remind us of how much we owe to their cleverness. The one is Bible and the other is paper. When we talk of the Bible, which just means the book, we are using one of the words which the Greeks used to describe the plant out of which the Egyptians made the material on which they wrote, and when we talk of paper, we are using another name, the commoner name of the same plant. For the Egyptians were the first people to make paper, and they used it for many centuries before other people had learned how much handier it was than the other things which they used. Yet if you saw an Egyptian book, you would think it was a very curious and clumsy thing indeed, and very different from the handy volumes which we use nowadays. When an Egyptian wanted to make a book, he gathered the stems of a kind of reed called the papyrus, which grew in some parts of Egypt in marshy ground. This plant grew to a height of from 12 to 15 feet, and had a stalk about 6 inches thick. The outer rind was peeled off this stalk, and then the inner part of it was separated, by means of a flat needle, into thin layers. These layers were joined to one another on a table, and a thin gum was spread over them, and then another layer was laid crosswise on the top of the first. The double sheet thus made was then put into a press, squeezed together, and dried. The sheets varied, of course, in breadth according to the purpose for which they were needed. The broadest that we know of measure about 17 inches across, but most are much narrower than that. When the Egyptian had got his paper, he did not make it up into a volume with the sheets bound together at the back, as we do. He joined them end to end, adding on sheet after sheet as he wrote, and rolling up his book as he went along, so when the book was done it formed a big roll, sometimes many feet long. There is one great book in the British Museum which measures 135 feet in length. You would think it very strange and awkward to have to handle a book like that. But if the book seemed curious to you, the writing in it would seem still more curious, for the Egyptian writing was certainly the quaintest, and perhaps the prettiest that has ever been known. It is called Hieroglyphic, which means sacred carving, and it is nothing but little pictures from beginning to end. The Egyptians began by putting down a picture of the thing which was represented by the word they wanted to use, and though by and by they formed a sort of alphabet to spell words with, and had besides signs that represented the different syllables of a word, still these signs were all little pictures. For instance, one of their signs for A was the figure of an eagle, their sign for M was a lion, and for U a little chicken, so that when you look at an Egyptian book written in the hieroglyphic character, you see column after column of birds and beasts and creeping things, of men and women and boats, and all sorts of other things, marching across the page. When the Egyptians wanted any of their writings to last for a very long time, they did not trust them to the frail papyrus rolls, but used another kind of book altogether. You have heard of sermons in stones? Well, a great many of the Egyptian books that tell us of the great deeds of the pharaohs were written on stone, carved deep and clear in the hard granite of a great obelisk, or in the limestone of a temple wall. When one of the kings came back from the wars, he generally published the account of his battles and victories by carving them on the walls of one of the great temples, or in a pillar set up in the court of a temple, and there they remain to this day for scholars to read. When the hieroglyphics were cut in stone, the lines were often filled in with paste of different colors, so that the whole writing was a blaze of beautiful tints, and the walls looked as if they were covered with finely colored hangings. Of course, the colors have mostly faded now, but there are still some temples and tombs where they can be seen, almost as fresh as when they were first laid on, and from these we can gather some idea of how wonderfully beautiful were these stone books of ancient Egypt. The scribes and carvers knew very well how beautiful their work was, and were careful to make it look as beautiful as possible, so that if they found the grouping of figures to make up a particular word or sentence was going to be ugly or clumsy, they would even prefer to spell the word wrong, rather than spoil the appearance of their picture writing. Some of you, I dare say, spell words wrong now and again, but I fancy it isn't because you think that they look prettier that way. But now let us turn back again to our papyrus roll. Suppose that we have got it, clean and fresh, and that our friend the scribe is going to write upon it. How does he go about it? To begin with, he draws from his belt a long, narrow wooden case, and lays it down beside him. This is his palette, rather a different kind of palette from the one which artists use. It is a piece of wood, with one long hollow in it, and 2 or 3 shallow round ones. The long hollow holds a few pens, which are made out of thin reeds, bruised at the ends so that their points are almost like little brushes. The shallow round hollows are for holding ink, black for most of the writing, red for special words, and perhaps one or two other colors, if the scribe is going to do a very fine piece of work. So he squats down, cross-legged, dips a reed pen in the ink, and begins. As he writes, he makes his little figures of men and beasts and birds face all in the one direction, and his readers will know they must always read from the point towards which the characters face. Now and then, when he comes to some specially important part, he draws, in gay colors, a little picture of the scene which the words describe. Now, you can understand that this picture writing was not very easy work to do when you had nothing but a bruised reed to draw all sorts of animals with. Gradually the pictures grew less and less like the creatures they stood for to begin with, and at last the old hieroglyphic broke down into a kind of running hand, where a stroke or two might stand for an eagle, a lion, or a man. And many of the Egyptian books are written in this kind of broken down hieroglyphic, which is called hieratic, or priestly writing. But some of the finest and costliest books were still written in the beautiful old style. On their papyrus rolls the Egyptians wrote all sorts of things: books of wise advice, stories like the fairy tales which we have been hearing, legends of the gods, histories, and poems, but the book that is oftenest met with is one of their religious books. It is nearly always called the Book of the Dead now, and some people call it the Egyptian Bible, but neither of these names is the right one. Certainly it is not in the least like the Bible, and the Egyptians themselves never called it the Book of the Dead. They called it the Chapters of Coming Forth by Day, and the reason they gave it that name was because they believed that if their dead friends knew all the wisdom that was written in it, they would escape all the dangers of the other world, and would be able in heaven to go in and out just as they had done upon earth, and to be happy forever. The book is full of all kinds of magical charms against the serpents and dragons, and all the other kinds of evil things that sought to destroy the dead person in the other world. The scribe used to write off copies of it by the dozen, and keep them in stock, with blank places for the names of the persons who were to use them. When any one died, his friends went away to a scribe, and brought a roll of the Book of the Dead, and the scribe filled in the name of the dead person in the blank places. Then the book was buried along with his mummy, so that when he met the demons and serpents on the road to heaven, he would know how to drive them away, and when he came to gates that had to be opened, or rivers that had to be crossed, he would know the right magical words to use. Some of these rolls of the Book of the Dead are very beautifully written, and illustrated with most wonderful little coloured pictures, representing different scenes of life in the other world, and it is from these that we have learned a great deal of what the Egyptians believed about the judgment after death, and heaven. But the common ones are very carelessly done. The scribes knew that the book was going to be buried at once, and that nobody was likely to ever see it again, so they did not care much whether they made mistakes or not, and often they missed out parts of the book altogether. They little thought that, thousands of years after they were dead, scholars would dig up their writings again, and read them, and see all their blunders. Of course, a great deal of this book is dreadful rubbish, and anything more unlike the noble and beautiful teachings of the Bible you can scarcely imagine. It has no more sense in it than the fee, fi, fo, fum of our fairy stories. Here is one little chapter from it. It is called the Chapter of Repulsing Serpents, and the Egyptians supposed that when a serpent attacked you on your way to heaven, you had only to recite this verse, and the serpent would be powerless to harm you. Hail, thou serpent Rerik! Advance not hither. Stand still now, and thou shalt eat the rat which is an abomination unto Ra, the sun god, and thou shalt crunch the bones of a filthy cat. It sounds very silly, doesn't it? And there are many things quite as silly as this in the book. You can scarcely imagine how wise people like the Egyptians could have ever believed in such drivel. But then, side by side with this miserable stuff, you find really wonderful and noble thoughts, that surely came to these men of ancient days from God himself, telling them how every man must be judged at last for all that he has done on earth, and how only those who have done justly, and loved mercy, and walked humbly with God, will be accepted by him. End of chapter 11. Read by Sibella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 12 of Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt, by James Baikie, read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. Temples and Tombs. Anyone traveling through our own land, or through any European country, to see the great buildings of long ago, would find that they were nearly all either churches or castles. There are the great cathedrals, very beautiful and wonderful, and there are the great buildings, sometimes partly palaces and partly fortresses, where kings and nobles lived in bygone days. Well, if you were traveling in Egypt to see its great buildings, you would find a difference. There are plenty of churches, or temples rather, and very wonderful they are, but there are no castles or palaces left, or at least there are next to none. Instead of palaces and castles, you would find tombs. Egypt, in fact, is a land of great temples and great tombs. Now, one can see why the Egyptians built great temples, for they were a very religious nation, and paid great honor to their gods. But why did they give so much attention to their tombs? The reason is, as you will hear more fully in another chapter, that there never was a nation which believed so firmly as did the Egyptians that the life after death was far more important than life in this world. They built their houses, and even their palaces, very lightly, partly of wood and partly of clay, because they knew that they were only going to live in them for a few years. But they called their tombs eternal dwelling places, and they have made them so wonderfully that they have lasted long after all the other buildings of the land, except the temples, have passed away. First of all, let me try to give you an idea of what an Egyptian temple must have been like in the days of its splendor. People come from all parts of the world to see even the ruins of these buildings, and they are altogether the most astonishing buildings in the world, but they are now only the skeletons of what the temples once were, and scarcely give you any more idea of their former glory and beauty than a human skeleton does of the beauty of a living man or woman. Suppose, then, that we are coming up to the gates of a great Egyptian temple in the days when it was still the house of God, who was worshipped by hundreds of thousands of people. As we pass out of the narrow streets of the city to which the temple belongs, we find ourselves standing upon a broad paved way, which stretches before us for hundreds of yards. On either side this way is bordered by a row of statues, and these statues are in the form of what we call Sphinxes; that is to say, they have bodies shaped like crouching lions, and on the lion body there is set the head of a different creature. Some of the Sphinxes, like the Great Sphinx, have human heads, but those which border the temple avenues have oftener either ram or jackal heads. As we pass along this avenue, two high towers rise before us, and between them is a great gateway. In front of the gate towers are two tall obelisks, slender, tapering shafts of red granite, like Cleopatra's Needle on the Thames Embankment. They are hewn out of single blocks of stone, carved all over with hieroglyphic figures, polished till they shine like mirrors, and their pointed tops are gilded so that they flash brilliantly in the sunlight. Beside the obelisks, which may be from 70 to 100 feet high, there are huge statues, perhaps 2, perhaps 4, of the king who built the temple. These statues represent the king as sitting upon his throne, with the double crown of Egypt, red and white, upon his head. They also are hewn out of single blocks of stone, and when you look at the huge figures you wonder how human hands could ever get such stones out of the quarry, sculpture them, and set them up. Before one of the temples of Thebes still lie the broken fragments of a statue of Ramesses II. When it was whole the statue must have been about 55 feet high, and the great block of granite must have weighed about 1,000 tons, the largest stone that was ever handled by human beings. Fastened to the towers are 4 tall flagstaves, 2 on either side of the gate, and from them float gaily coloured pennons. The walls of the towers are covered with pictures of the wars of the king. Here you see him charging in his chariot upon his fleeing enemies. Here again he is seizing a group of captives by the hair, and raising his mace or his sword to kill them. But whatever he is doing, he is always gigantic, while his foes are mere helpless human beings. All these carvings are brilliantly painted, and the whole front of the building glows with colour. It is really a kind of pictorial history of the king's reign. Now we stand in front of the gate. Its 2 leaves are made of cedar wood brought from Lebanon, but you cannot see the wood at all, for it is overlaid with plates of silver chased with beautiful designs. Passing through the gateway, we find ourselves in a broad open court. All round it runs a kind of cloister, whose roof is supported upon tall pillars, their capitals carved to represent the curling leaves of the palm tree. In the middle of the court there stands a tall pillar of stone, inscribed with the story of the great deeds of Pharaoh, and his gifts to the god of the temple. It is inlaid with turquoise, malachite, and lapis lazuli, and sparkles with precious stones. At the farther side of this court, another pair of towers and another gateway lead you into the second court. Here we pass at once out of the brilliant sunlight into semi-darkness, for this court is entirely roofed over, and no light enters it except from the doorway and from grated slits in the roof. Look around you, and you will see the biggest single chamber that was ever built by the hands of man. Down the centre run 2 lines of gigantic pillars which hold up the roof, and from the nave of the hall, and beyond these on either side are the aisles, whose roofs are supported by a perfect forest of smaller columns. Look up to the 12 great pillars of the nave. They soar above your head, 70 feet into the air, their capitals bending outwards in the shape of open flowers. On each capital 100 men could stand safely, and the great stone roofing beams that stretch from pillar to pillar weigh 100 tons apiece. How were they ever brought to the place? And, still more, how were they ever swung up to that dizzy height, and laid in their places? Each of the great columns is sculptured with figures and gaily painted, and the surrounding walls of the hall are all decorated in the same way. But when you look at the pictures, you find that it is no longer the wars of the king that are represented. The inside of the temple is too holy for such things. Instead, you have pictures of the gods, and of the king making all kinds of offerings to them, and these pictures are repeated again and again, with endless inscriptions, telling of the great gifts which Pharaoh has given to the temple. Finally, we pass into the Holy of Holies. Here no light of day ever enters at all. The chamber, smaller and lower than either of the others, is in darkness except for the dim light of the lamp carried by the attendant priest. Here stands the shrine, a great block of granite, hewn into a dwelling place for the figure of the god. It is closed with cedar doors covered with gold plates, and the doors are sealed, but if we could persuade the priest to let us look within, we should see a small wooden figure something like the one that we saw carried through the streets of Thebes, dressed and painted, and surrounded by offerings of meat, drink, and flowers. For this little figure all the glories that we have passed through have been created. An army of priests attends upon it day by day, dresses and paints it, spreads food before it, offers sacrifices, and sings hymns in its praise. Behind the sanctuary lie storehouses, which hold corn and fruits and wines enough to supply a city in time of siege. The god is a great proprietor, holding more land than any of the nobles of the country. He has a revenue almost as great as that of Pharaoh himself. He has troops of his own, an army which obeys no orders but his. On the Red Sea he has one fleet, bringing to his temple the spices and incense of Southland, and from the Nile mouths another fleet sails to bring home cedar wood from Lebanon, and costly stuffs from Tyre. His priests have far more power than the greatest barons of the land, and Pharaoh, mighty as he is, would think twice before offending a band of men whose hatred could shake him on his throne. Such was an Egyptian temple 3,000 years ago, when Egypt was the greatest power in the world. But if the temples of ancient Egypt are wonderful, the tombs are almost more wonderful still. Very early in their history the Egyptians began to show their sense of the importance of the life after death by raising huge buildings to hold the bodies of their great men. Even the earliest kings, who lived before there was any history at all, had great underground chambers scooped out and furnished with all sorts of things for their use in the afterlife. But it is when we come to that King Khufu, who figures in the fairy stories of Zazamankh and Dedi, that we begin to understand what a wonderful thing an Egyptian tomb might be. Not very far from Cairo, the capital of modern Egypt, a line of strange, pointed buildings rises against the sky on the edge of the desert. These are the pyramids, the tombs of the great kings of Egypt in early days, and if we want to know what Egyptian builders could do 4,000 years before Christ, we must look at them. Take the largest of them, the Great Pyramid, called the Pyramid of Cheops. Cheops is really Khufu, the king who was so much put out by Dedi's prophecy about Rudiday's 3 babies. No such building was ever reared either before or since. It stands even now 450 feet in height, and before the peak was destroyed, it was about 30 feet higher. Each of its 4 sides measures over 750 feet in length, and it covers more than 12 acres of ground, the size of a pretty large field. But you will get the best idea of how tremendous a building it is when I tell you that if you used it as a quarry, you could build a town big enough to hold all the people of Aberdeen out of the Great Pyramid; or if you broke up the stones of which it is built, and laid them in a line a foot broad and a foot deep, the line would reach a good deal more than halfway around the world at the equator. You would have some trouble in breaking up the stones, however, for many of the great blocks weigh from 40 to 50 tons apiece, and they are so beautifully fitted to one another that you could not get the edge of a sheet of paper into the joints. Inside this great mountain of stone there are long passages leading to 2 small rooms in the centre of the pyramid, and in one of these rooms, called the King's Chamber, the body of the greatest builder the world has ever seen was laid in its stone coffin. The passages were closed with heavy plug blocks of stone, so that no one should ever disturb the sleep of King Khufu. But in spite of all precautions, robbers mined their way into the pyramid ages ago, plundered the coffin, and scattered to the winds the remains of the king, so that, as Byron says, not a pinch of dust remains of Cheops. The other pyramids are smaller, though if the Great Pyramid had not been built, the second and third would have been counted the world's wonders. Near the second pyramid sits the Great Sphinx. It is a huge statue, human-headed and lion-bodied, carved out of limestone rock. Who carved it, or whose face it bears, we do not certainly know; but there the great figure crouches, as it has crouched for countless ages, keeping watch and ward over the empty tombs where the Pharaohs of Egypt once slept, its head towering 70 feet into the air, its vast limbs and body stretching for 200 feet along the sand, the strangest and most wonderful monument ever hewn by the hands of man. Later on in Egyptian history the kings and great folk grew tired of building pyramids, and the fashion changed. Instead of raising huge structures above the ground, they began to hew out caverns in the rocks in which to lay their dead. Round about Thebes, the rocks on the western side of the Nile are honeycombed with these strange houses of the departed. Their walls in many cases are decorated with bright and cheerful pictures, showing scenes of the life which the dead man lived on earth. There he stands, or sits, placid and happy, with his wife beside him, while all around him his servants go about their usual work. They plough and hoe, sow and reap; they gather grapes from the vines and put them into the winepress, or they bring the first fruits of the earth to present them before their master. In other pictures you see the great man going out to his amusements, fishing, hunting, or fowling; or you are taken into the town, and see the tradesmen working, and the merchants, and the townsfolk buying and selling in the bazaars. In fact, the whole of life in ancient Egypt passes before your eyes as you go from chamber to chamber, and it is from these old tomb pictures that we have learned the most of what we know of how people lived and worked in those long past days. In one wild, rocky glen, called the Valley of the Kings, nearly all the later pharaohs were buried, and today their tombs are one of the sights of Thebes. Let us look at the finest of them, the tomb of Seti I, the father of that Ramses II of whom we have heard so much. Entering the dark doorway in the cliff, you descend through passage after passage and hall after hall, until at last you reach the 14th chamber, 470 feet from the entrance, where the great king was laid in his magnificent alabaster coffin. The walls and pillars of each chamber are wonderfully carved and painted. The pillars show pictures of the king making offerings to the gods, or being welcomed by them, but the pictures on the walls are very strange and weird. They represent the voyage of the sun through the realms of the underworld, and all the dangers and difficulties which the soul of the dead man has to encounter as he accompanies the sun bark on its journey. Serpents, bats, crocodiles, spitting fire, or armed with spears, pursue the wicked. The unfortunates who fall into their power are tortured in all kinds of horrible ways; their hearts are torn out, their heads are cut off, they are boiled in cauldrons, or hung head downwards over lakes of fire. Gradually the soul passes through all these dangers into the brighter scenes of the fields of the blessed, where the justified sow and reap and are happy. Finally the king arrives, purified, at the end of his long journey, and is welcomed by the gods into the abode of the blessed, where he too dwells as a god in everlasting life. The beautiful alabaster coffin in which the mummy of King Seti was laid is now in the Sonne Museum, London. When it was discovered, nearly a century ago, it was empty, and it was not until 1872 that some modern tomb robbers found the body of the king, along with other royal mummies, hidden away in a deep pit among the cliffs. Now it lies in the museum at Cairo, and you can see the face of this great king, its fine, proud features not so very much changed, we can well believe, from what they were when he reigned 3,200 years ago. In the same museum you can look upon the faces of Thutmose III, the greatest soldier of Egypt, of Ramesses II, the oppressor of the Israelites, and, perhaps most interesting of all, of Merenptah, the Pharaoh who hardened his heart when Moses pled with him to let the Hebrews go, and whose picked troops were drowned in the Red Sea as they pursued their escaping slaves. It is very strange to think that one can see the actual features and forms on which the heroes of our Bible story looked in life. The reason of such a thing is that the Egyptians believed that when a man died, his soul, which passed to the life beyond, loved to return to its old home on earth, and find again the body in which it once dwelt, and even, perhaps, that the soul's existence in the other world depended in some way on the preservation of the body. So they made the bodies of their dead friends into what we call mummies, steeping them away for many days in pitch and spices till they were embalmed, and then wrapping them round in fold upon fold of fine linen. So they have endured all these hundreds of years, to be stored at last in a museum, and gazed upon by people who live in lands which were savage wildernesses when Egypt was a great and mighty empire. End of chapter 12. Read by Sabella Denton. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt by James Baikie. Read into the public domain for LibriVox.org. An Egyptian's Heaven. In this chapter I want to tell you a little about what the Egyptians thought of heaven, what it was, where it was, how people got there after death, and what kind of a life they lived when they were there. They had some very quaint and curious ideas about the heavens themselves. They believed, for instance, that the blue sky overhead was something like a great iron plate spread over the world, and supported at the four corners, north, south, east, and west, by high mountains. The stars were like little lamps, which hung down from this plate. Right round the world ran a great celestial river, and on this river the sun sailed day after day in his bark, giving light to the world. You could only see him as he passed round from the east by the south to the west, for after that the river ran behind high mountains, and the sun passed out of sight to sail through the world of darkness. Behind the sun, and appearing after he had vanished, came the moon, sailing in its own bark. It was protected by two guardian eyes, which watched always over it, and it needed the protection, for every month it was attacked by a great enemy in the form of a sow. For a fortnight the moon sailed on safely, and grew fuller and rounder, but at the middle of the month, just when it was full, the sow attacked it, tore it out of its place, and flung it into the celestial river, where for another fortnight it was gradually extinguished, to be revived again at the beginning of the next month. That was the Egyptians' curious way of accounting for the waxing and waning of the moon, and many of their other ideas were just as quaint as this. I do not mean to say anything of what they believed about God, for they had so many gods, and believed such strange things about them, that it would only confuse you if I tried to make you understand it all. But the most important thing in all the Egyptian religion was the belief in heaven, and in the life which people lived there after their life on earth was ended. No other nation of these old times ever believed so firmly, as did the Egyptians, that men were immortal, and did not cease to be when they died, but only began a new life, which might be either happy or miserable, according to the way in which they had lived on earth. They had a lot of different beliefs about the life after death, some of them rather confusing and difficult to understand, but I shall tell you only the main things and the simplest things which they believed. They said then that very long ago, when the world was young, there was a great and good king called Osiris, who reigned over Egypt, and was very good to his subjects, teaching them all kinds of useful knowledge. But Osiris had a wicked brother named Set, who hated him, and was jealous of him. One day Set invited Osiris to a supper, at which he had gathered a number of his friends who were in the plot with him. When they were all feasting gaily, he produced a beautiful chest, and offered to give it to the man who fitted it. One after another they lay down in the chest, but it fitted none of them. Then at last Osiris lay down in it, and as soon as he was inside, his wicked brother and the other plotters fastened the lid down upon him, and threw the chest into the Nile. It was carried away by the river, and at last was washed ashore, with the dead body of the good king still in it. But Isis, wife of Osiris, sought for her husband everywhere, and at last she found the chest with his body. While she was weeping over it, the wicked Set came upon her, tore his brother's body to pieces, scattered the fragments far and wide, but the faithful Isis tracked them all, and buried them wherever she found them. Now Isis had a son named Horus, and when he grew to manhood he challenged Set, fought with him, and defeated him. Then the gods all assembled, and gave judgment that Osiris was in the right, and Set in the wrong. They raised Osiris up from the dead, made him a god, and appointed him to be the judge of all men after death. And then, not all at once, but gradually, the Egyptians came to believe that because Osiris died, and rose again from the dead, and lived forever after death, therefore all those men who believed in Osiris would live again after death, and dwell forever with Osiris. You see that in some respects the story is strangely like that of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Well, then, they supposed that when a man died on earth, after his body was mummified and laid in its tomb, his soul went on to the gates of the palace of Osiris in the other world, where was the hall of truth, in which souls were judged. The soul had to know the magic names of the gates before it could even enter the hall, but as soon as these names were spoken the gates opened, and the soul went in. Within the hall there stood a great pair of scales, and beside the scales stood a god, ready to mark down the result of the judgment, while all round the hall sat 42 terrible creatures, who had authority to punish particular sins. The soul had to make confession to these avengers of sin that he had not been guilty of the sins which they had the power to punish. Then, when he had made his confession, his heart was taken, and weighed in the scales against a feather, which was the Egyptian sign for truth. If it was not of the right weight, the man was false, and his heart was thrown to a dreadful monster, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, which sat behind the balances, and devoured the hearts of the unjust. But if it was right, then Horus, the son of Osiris, took the man by the hand, and led him into the presence of Osiris the judge, and he was pronounced just, and admitted to heaven. But what was heaven? Well, the Egyptians had several different ideas about it. One rather pretty one was that the souls which were pronounced just were taken up into the sky, and there became stars, shining down for ever upon the world. Another was that they were permitted to enter the boat, in which, as I told you, the sun sails round the world day by day, and to keep company with the sun on his unending voyage. But the idea that most believed in and loved was that somewhere away in a mysterious land to the west there lay a wonderful and beautiful country, called the Field of Bulrushes. There the corn grew 3½ yards high, and the ears of corn were a yard long. Through the fields ran lovely canals, full of fish, and bordered with reeds and bulrushes. When the soul had passed the judgment hall, it came, by strange hard roads, and through great dangers, to this beautiful country. And there the dead man, dead now no more, but living forever, spent his time in endless peace and happiness, sowing and reaping, paddling in his canoe along the canals, or resting and playing draughts in the evening under the sycamore trees. Now I suppose that all this seemed quite a happy sort of heaven to most of the common people, who had been accustomed all their days to hard work and harder fare, but by and by the great nobles came to think that a heaven of this sort was not quite good enough for them. They had never done any work on earth, why should they have to do any in heaven? So they thought that they would find out a way of taking their slaves with them into the other world. I fancy that at first they actually tried to take them by killing the slaves at their master's grave. When the funeral of a great man took place, some of his servants would be killed beside the tomb, so that they might go with their lord into heaven, and work for him there, as they had worked for him on earth. But the Egyptians were always a gentle, kind-hearted people, and they quickly grew disgusted with the idea of such cruelty, so they found another way out of the difficulty. They got numbers of little clay figures made in the form of servants, one with a hoe on his shoulder, another with a basket in his hand, and so on. They called these little figures answerers, and when a man was buried, they buried a lot of these clay servants along with him, so that when he reached heaven, and was summoned to do work in the field of bulrushes, the answerers would rise up and answer for him, and take the task off his shoulders. So, along with the mummies of the dead Egyptians, there is often found quite a number of these tiny figures, all ready to make heaven easy for their master when he gets there. They have sometimes a little verse written upon them, to tell the answerer what he has got to do in the other world. It runs like this: O thou answerer, when I am called, and when I am asked to do any kind of work that is done in heaven, and am required at any time to cause the field to flourish, or to convey the sand from east to west, thou shalt say, Here am I. It all seems a rather curious idea of heaven, does it not? And most curious of all is the idea of dodging work in the other world by carrying a bundle of china dolls to heaven with you. But even if we think that very ridiculous, we need not forget that the Egyptians had a wonderfully clear and sure grasp of the fact that it is a man's character in this world which will make him either happy or unhappy in the next, and that evil doing, even if it escapes punishment in this life, is a thing that God will surely punish at last. Remember that these men of old, wonderfully wise and strong as they were in many ways, were still children of the time when the world was young, like children, forming many false and even ridiculous ideas about things they could not understand, like children, too, reaching out their groping hands through the darkness to a Father whose love they felt, though they could not explain his ways. We need not wonder if at times they made mistakes, and went far astray. We may wonder far more at the way in which he taught them so many true and noble things and thoughts, never leaving himself without a witness, even in those days of long ago. The End. End of Chapter 13. Of Peeps at Many Lands, Ancient Egypt, by James Baikie. Read by Sibella Denton into the public domain for LibriVox.org. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more free audiobooks or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.